G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through the price change algorithm and what that means for building budget for our fantasy teams. So if you're new around here and you're enjoying this kind of content, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we jump into unpacking the price change algorithm and how we can strategize our lineups and decisions each week, I do want to also give a shout out to some of the great work in the F1 fantasy community. Obviously, a lot of this information has been pulled together by F1 Fantasy Tools. They are the GOATs when it comes to points projections, analysis, and all that good stuff in F1 Fantasy. So you should be following them if you don't already do so. I would also like to just call out Rain, Ewan, and Tom, three of the biggest F1 fantasy content creators on YouTube and Twitter. They've already done really great jobs on this model so far, and I do admit I'm a little slow to the party, but there's a couple of reasons for that which we'll get into in just a moment. So I do want to shout out those guys. They've already done some really good videos on their channels, which you should also watch if you haven't got to that point at this point. So let's get straight into the price change algorithm. It is a new model in place for 2025, and I am recording this after China before Japan in the break between the two races. Now, as I said, a very new price change model. We previously had 3 tiers in 2024. We only have 2 this year, the A and the B tier. The A being greater than or equal to 19 million as we know it at this point, and the B tier being under 19 million. We'll get into those assets in those tiers in just a second. But in terms of how the price changes for these assets in these tiers is decided this season is again very different to last year's model. It's largely based on the points per million that an asset has been calculated at. And that's determined by taking the score of the asset in a particular race weekend and dividing it by the price of that asset. The points per million, I guess, in essence is for every dollar you spend on an asset, you would expect to receive 1 fantasy point in return. So on a 1 point per million basis. So let's say, for example, in a hypothetical situation, Lando Norris was 50 million. At a 1 point per million basis, if Lando Norris was priced at 50 million, he should be scoring 50 points per fantasy week. Obviously, that's not the case, given he's a lot cheaper than that, but that's just a very general example of what you should expect on a X points per million basis. In terms of the price changes, they are dictated by how the asset performs each week. We've got 4 kind of constituencies of what the asset's performance is guided by: great, good, poor, or terrible, and the corresponding price increases or decreases based on the threshold that that asset meets. So in the A tier, for example, a great performance would receive a $0.3 million increase, a good performance a $0.1 million increase, poor negative $0.1 million, and terrible negative $0.3 million. Given it is a symmetrical pricing model, the B tier has those increases or decreases doubled. So as you can see, a B tier great performance would be a $0.6 million increase, good 0.2, so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind as well. We're seeing bigger swings and price changes each week because of this revised model, and that definitely factors into our thinking each race week, when obviously we're not just looking at points, but I think avoiding or negating any kind of risk with those swingy changes that we are seeing, particularly in the B tier where the swings can be even more significant. And obviously I talked about points per million a little bit already. To calculate the average points per million, we need to obviously determine that to see where that performance from that asset falls into in the table above based on that category. So we're going to go through a couple of examples in just a second, but I do want to kind of give you that rundown of what the average points per million means on a 3-week rolling average, which is, as F1 Fantasy has pointed out on their website, the approach for this season. So as you guys can see here, we've got an A tier and a B tier class for all 20 drivers and then the 10 constructors on the next slide. At the time of recording, we have 7 drivers in the A tier, which, as we understand, is greater than or equal to 19 million, and 13 drivers in the B tier, which is less than 19 million. Now, I've got Yuki and Liam, obviously, in their old race suits, but with their new teams in parentheses, so just keep that in mind. Yuki is the highest B tier driver, and Liam somewhere in the middle, based on the current setup at the time of recording. But as I said, this will likely change over the course of the season. So we may see assets move in between the A and the B tier depending on their race performance and ongoing fantasy production as a result of that. Same again for the constructors. We have 4 in the A tier, 6 in the B tier. And again, that is going to fluctuate, I think, over the season. We may see a couple move between the A and the B, but I think for the most part, it's probably where I expect most of these guys to sit for the remainder of the season. So, given the considerations I mentioned before around trying to identify and understand those swingier assets, I do think B tier constructors could be quite popular this season. But as I said, we'll get into that in just a moment and what that means for the implications of our fantasy teams. So I want to put this into practice, free practice, pardon the pun, for how we can reach these calculations. Now, before I get into the worked example on the screen here, F1 Fantasy on the website, on the homepage, did indicate that this season it will be based on a 3-week rolling average. So at the time of recording, we've completed 2 races, Australia and China. From Japan onwards, that will factor in totality 3 races of data. So at this point, and you'll see in the example below, we only have 2 races of data, and for the purposes of calculating the average points per million and what that means for the performance category, we're obviously for this hypothetical 3rd race taking a 0 value because we only have 2 races up to this point in time. From Japan onwards for the rest of the season, we will just naturally take the preceding 3 races. So that's why in the 3-race average calculation down on the screen, which we'll get to in just a moment, is why you're seeing a 0 value for that average. So the step 1 of putting this into practice is to calculate the average points per million. We've got, as I've pointed out already, 4 different thresholds in each of the different races, and the Japan onwards category, or column I should say, will be the threshold that each driver and constructor is required to meet to satisfy that price increase or decrease. The second step is to determine what performance category the asset falls into. This table, you probably recall, was on the first page of the presentation on the video, and those symmetrical pricing models is again what an A tier or a B tier asset will receive based on their performance that race week. So let's put this into practice and give you a couple of worked examples, one for a driver and one for a constructor. In Alex Albon's case, Alex scored 11 fantasy points in China. The 3-race average based on his historical 3-race performance was 11 in China, 17 in Australia, and I pointed out as before a 0-point data point, if we can call it that, given there was no race before Australia. If we were doing this, as I said, from Japan, it would be Japan's score, China's score, and Australia's score. So you take the totality of those 3 most recent races and then divide it by 3 to get the average. Alex's score over the last 3 races is 9.3. And then to get his average PPM, you divide it by the price he had before China. Now, that price was 12.6. And to get the average PPM, you take the 9.3 and divide it by the 12.6 to get 0.74. You can see that 0.74 for Alex Albon fits into the good classification in the first table of step 1 between 0.6 and 0.8. So that's where the 0.74 slots in. And then taking that good categorization for Alex Albon, apply it to the good benchmark for a B tier asset, which is what he is. He's under 19 million. And that's where you get the $0.2 million price increase. So that's Alex Albon's example. If we take Ferrari as a constructor, they had minus 23 in China on the back of their double disqualification. Still haven't got over that. And to get their 3-race average, you take their China score, their Australia score, and then the hypothetical 0 from the non-existent other race, and divide that by 3 to get 4.3 points over the 3 races. So that would be minus 23 plus 36 is 13 plus 0, and then divided by 3 gets you 4.3. Once you've got the 3-race average, same as Alex Albon, you divide the 4.3 by their price before China, and that gives you the 27.4 million. that 4.3 divided by 27.4 gets you an average points per million of 0.16, which if you go up to the table at the top is a terrible rating, so less than 0.4. And if we follow the subsequent table for the category the asset falls into, for this particular price adjustment, we get to a terrible rating of negative 0.3 million, which was the price adjustment Ferrari received after China. So hopefully that makes sense. I know it's quite a bit of math to wrap your head around. And I appreciate that for the casual fan trying to understand this probably isn't ideal, but that's obviously just to give you more granularity and context to what is actually driving these price increases, and that they aren't just arbitrary numbers in the air that the developers are using to change prices every race week. So in a sense, how can we actually use this information to help inform our decision-making process every single week? There's probably a number of different factors and indicators that can drive our decision making these race weeks. And if you've been paying attention, on the right hand side of the screen, I've been providing different budget building tips, all of which culminate onto this slide here. So the thing I would like to point out first is that absolutely we need to focus on building budget. I think we saw from some of the best teams in F1 Fantasy in 2024 that those that really prioritized building budget earlier in the season actually had such a significant advantage later in the year. Instead of having 2 premium drivers and 2 premium constructors, some of the teams in the top 10 had 3 premium drivers and 2 premium constructors. So I'm not suggesting suddenly let's sacrifice all of the point scoring upside we have and only focus on building budget. I think there's definitely a sweet spot for both of that. And you're probably going to see quite a few people run at least 1 premium driver, whether it's Norris, Piastri. I've seen some people run Kimi Antonelli and even George Russell, and at least 1 premium constructor. And McLaren seems to be the popular pick at the moment, simply because McLaren is looking like the strongest team in Formula One at the time of recording. So I'm not saying you have to focus all of your energy into getting 7 B tier assets and try and squeeze the absolute maximum out of those $0.6 million increases. But I definitely think going for 4, 5 B tier assets and having a very dominant or competitive 2X driver with maybe a McLaren could be one such way of finding that sweet spot in the early goings of the season. For how long we build budget, I think that's quite subjective and team dependent. Some people might only want to do it for 7 races. Some people might want to do it until the mid-season break. But I think there's still a world in which up until even the last 4 or 5 races of the season, that you could absolutely continue to build budget and focus on those value accretive assets. I think another thing to think about is taking advantage of those underpriced assets before they move into a higher tier. An example of that recently is Kimi Antonelli, who moved from the B tier to the A tier. And I'm not suggesting that's going to happen regularly throughout the season. We might see Tsunoda in that Red Bull, who's expected to be in that seat for the rest of the season, move into the A tier down the line. So he's one such asset that stands out to me. But having that flexibility to maneuver between these different assets that are going to see regular sustained price increases is one such thing to think about. Another thing around flexibility is just also, if you do have multiple cheap assets, and I'm looking at the Hadjars, the Bortoletos, it's going to be difficult if they have DNFs to move into high-priced assets that have that price increase upside. So I think it's perfectly fine to maybe have one of those, but having 2, 3 really cheap drivers limits that kind of flexibility to maneuver your team around to get more of those budget building assets in at the right time. So just keep that in mind. Again, I'm not saying there's only one such way to skin a cat, but having that flexibility to move between those right assets at the right times is absolutely essential to, again, sustaining those price rises. Using Limitless and Wildcard, really good chips to use to obviously capitalize on those price change increases. We saw a lot of people use the Wildcard successfully in China. I'd say successfully to an extent because it was also helped by Ferrari's disqualification, but I think it's clearly a situation where earlier in the season using the wildcard to pile onto those price increases is very effective. Timing the Limitless on weekends where if you have enough budget building assets the week before, then Limitless. We've got Miami coming up. I think that's going to be very popular. Will certainly help the case to not just maximize those points over 1 or 2 weekends, but obviously also increase your budget over that same period of time. And as I said, targeting those assets with upside to maximize not just the points and their points per million, but obviously those price rises, I think will put your team in good stead for multiple weeks at a time. Now, in terms of timing things correctly, riding the right $0.6 million waves for those in the B tier, because they're obviously going to gain more budget, will enable you to pivot between, as I said, other B tier assets that are going to have greater upside than those A tier assets, and try and get off before. Obviously, I think before would be somewhat luck dependent, if not in reality after these B tier assets DNF, because obviously we know how severe the $0.6 million price drop in the B tier is. So making sure you can time those price rises and part from those assets as they start to decrease in DNF and trend downwards. And I think we're seeing this already very early in the season. The likes of Borderletto, Hajar, that DNF'd in Australia. Until that DNF falls off their rolling 3-week average, they are poisonous, and avoiding them not just for the first week they DNF, but subsequent weeks where their price will continue to go down will also position your team to sustain their current team value. Another thing, and just interesting to me, is because of the new points per million thresholds, our transfers feel like it right now, I could be wrong, they feel like right now they're based a little more on historical results and dilutes the effectiveness and value of free practice, because I think naturally we're inclined to move towards assets that are going to increase in price based on these thresholds they have to meet. And regardless of whether the asset is actually good on track, doesn't sometimes even matter in some cases, simply because they just don't have to DNF to get a price rise. And I'm going to bring something up from F1 Fantasy Tools to hopefully explain what I mean by that. I've obviously cited them on the bottom of the page just before, but an example of what I mean by that is this budget building tab that these guys have created on f1fantasytools.com. I've used it a couple of times already in my videos, so I direct you towards this site if you haven't done so before. But what I mean by that is, regardless of, as I said, whether an asset's actually good on track, I take Ferrari as a great example, who just had a double disqualification in China, defied the odds, endgame kind of stuff, as Ewan mentioned on Twitter, is these guys were on track for multiple price increases before China. They've obviously had this disqualification, and in order to negate the damaging effects of that disqualification, Ferrari have to score more than 61 to see a price increase in Japan. Now, I think on paper and even on track, Ferrari are good, but the likelihood of them scoring 61 is not that high. And so for me as an owner, I'm looking to get rid of them simply because the odds are not necessarily in their favor to not just score a boon of points, but also increase and offset that negative score from China as a result. So for that reason, because the threshold for them to reach even just a $0.3 million uptick in price is so high, I'm inclined to bin them off, and I haven't even got to free practice to make that decision already. I think the same goes in a very different situation for Haas. They're by no means the strongest team on paper, but have to score more than negative 31 points to go up 0.6 million. So it makes them, given how low the likelihood of a double DNF or a double disqualification is, and I say that Haas had all of those in Monaco last year, but given that that likelihood is so low and they only need to score a negative 30 or more to go up in price, just makes me think that we don't even need to see practice to make our decisions. So that's just one kind of reservation I have about the pricing model for this season. I think you can make the case for different drivers and constructors depending on obviously how results shake out week to week. But yeah, that's my initial takeaways of the budget building and price change model for this season. I'm really curious to see how this shakes out in F1 Fantasy this year, but does obviously give us another element of how to structure our teams and make our decisions every single race week in F1 Fantasy. So hopefully that has explained everything to you guys. I know I've tried to do it in under 20 minutes, not to bore you to death, but trying to make sure I capture as much as possible. But if you do have any additional questions, please let me know down in the comments below. It's very possible I've probably missed something, so please let me know if there is anything I've overlooked that the community should hopefully be obviously informed on. But F1 Fantasy Tools, I would 100% recommend you subscribe to their Patreon, use their resources. It is truly fantastic and has changed the game with how we play F1 Fantasy. So I'm going to leave that video now. Leave that video there for now, guys. Honestly, I'm losing my mind this late at night recording this video, but I hope it has served as a helpful resource. I'll be back with plenty more content throughout the season, team selection, race week previews, final thoughts, deadline streams. So if you're interested, as always, in seeing that stuff, be sure to throw a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all very soon.